Patton stood before the church and said nothing. The walls still held. The roof had caved inward on itself. His officers recognized every variety of silence Patton carried. The cold silence that preceded the firing of a commander. The taut silence before a major push. This was neither. This was the silence of a man who had just learned that 83 human beings, women and children among them, had been herded into this building and burned alive, and that the officer who issued the order had described the act, once captured, in the measured and detached language of a routine field operation. Patton had believed he understood the enemy he was fighting. He stood amid the wreckage of the village of Marzas in Alsace, and grasped that his understanding had been shallow. The village of Marzas had been a small place before the war. The kind of settlement that exists by the thousands across rural France, anchored to a church and a square, populated by families who had worked the same soil for generations, rooted with the permanence of communities that have not moved in centuries. By the time Patton's soldiers arrived in the winter of 1944, it was no longer a village. It was scorched walls and caved-in roofs, and a silence particular to places where something has occurred that the land itself cannot seem to absorb. The first soldiers to enter what was left of Marzas discovered survivors. Few, but some. People who had concealed themselves in cellars and forests, who crept out when they heard American voices and the growl of American engines. People who had waited for months in that suspended condition known only to those who have witnessed catastrophe and outlived it, and who do not yet know what outliving it requires, or what follows. These survivors told the soldiers what had taken place. The soldiers relayed it up the chain of command. The report reached Patton. What the survivors described had unfolded in the summer of 1944. During the weeks after the Allied landings in Normandy, German occupation forces across Alsace had been carrying out what they termed security operations, responding to growing French resistance activity in the region. The SS unit assigned to the area had received intelligence, reliable or otherwise, that the village had been sheltering resistance fighters. The unit's commander, an SS Oberführer named Heinrich Brenner, reached a decision consistent with the doctrine his men had been trained to execute. A decision that, by the standards of the Eastern Front, where many of them had previously served, was not regarded as exceptional. He assembled his unit, moved on the village before dawn, ordered the entire population gathered in the square, separated the men from the women and children. The men, roughly 80 of them, boys as young as 16 through old men in their 70s, were marched to the edge of the village, shot. The women and children were forced into the church. The church was set ablaze. Those who attempted to climb through the windows were gunned down. The village was then destroyed methodically, structure by structure, until nothing survived that might shelter a resistance fighter or serve as a base for further operations. The survivors were people who had not been present that morning. A farmer who had gone to his fields at first light, seen the smoke rising, and hidden rather than turned back. A woman visiting relatives in a neighboring village who returned to find what was left. A 14-year-old boy sent on an errand the previous night who threw himself into a ditch when the gunfire started and stayed there for hours, motionless, until the sound ceased. They had carried what they knew since that summer, told no one because there was no one to receive the telling. German occupation authorities had no interest in their account. Neighboring villages understood precisely what had happened and held their tongues, gripped by the specific silence of communities that have been shown what befalls communities that are not silent. And so the truth of what was done at Marzas had lived inside a narrow circle of survivors and witnesses, unrecorded, unacknowledged, until the soldiers of Patton's Third Army rolled in and the survivors at last had someone willing to hear them. Patton drove to Marzas himself. His staff had learned something about him by this stage of the campaign. When reports like this arrived, Patton would go see the damage with his own eyes. No one bothered suggesting his time was better spent at headquarters. That argument had never worked. It wasn't going to start working now. He reached the village that morning in his staff car. His aide rode with him. A small security detail followed. And then he walked through what was left of Marzas, the survivors themselves leading the way, pointing, explaining, remembering. He said almost nothing during that walk. The officers beside him had watched Patton in dozens of situations. Under fire, in fury, in triumph, in frustration. They knew his silences the way they knew his speeches. Each type carried a different frequency. And the silence he held as he moved through those burned ruins was one they had never encountered before. This was not the silence of a man holding back rage. That silence they recognized instantly. This was something else entirely. This was a man absorbing something that demanded every ounce of his attention to take in. Something rearranging his understanding of the war, what it was, what it had always been, from the very first day. He stopped at the church. The outer walls still stood, but the roof had caved inward, and the interior was nothing but collapsed timber and ash. Through an interpreter, the survivors told him what had taken place inside those walls. He listened to every word. He did not cut anyone short. He did not turn his gaze away. When they finished speaking, he stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the church. Then he said something quiet. His aide wrote it down. It appears in the official records of the Third Army from this period. He said he had believed he understood what they were fighting against. He said he had been wrong about how deep that understanding actually went. What had been done in this village, it was not a military act. It had never been intended as one. It was something else. Something that had no name in the military vocabulary he had spent a lifetime constructing. And the fact that no name existed for it, that absence itself told him something. It told him how far outside the boundaries of anything he had ever been trained to consider this thing actually was. Then he asked for the name of the commander responsible. The survivors gave him what they had: the SS unit designation, a physical description of the officer who had issued the orders, a name some of them had overheard, Brenner, though none could say with certainty whether the spelling was right, whether it was a first name or a surname, or whether it was truly a name at all, rather than something else entirely. Patton turned to his intelligence staff. He gave them direct instructions. Finding the commander responsible for Marzas was now an intelligence priority. He wanted everything they could uncover: the unit, its movement since the summer, its current position, and the identity and whereabouts of its commanding officer. He made one thing clear. He was not seeking this information for the purpose of military prosecution. That process would follow proper channels after the war ended. He wanted this information because understanding what had been done, who had done it, how it had been made possible, was knowledge the army required. Without it, they could not fully grasp what they were actually fighting. Then he said something more. He said every soldier in the Third Army needed to understand that Marzas was not an aberration. It was not the work of a single rogue unit that had exceeded what its commanders intended or sanctioned. It was the logical endpoint of a system designed to produce precisely this outcome. And the soldiers fighting that system needed to see it with total clarity. No euphemism. No comfortable distance created by ignorance of what the system actually did when it functioned exactly as built. He said he was going to make certain the men of the Third Army learned about Marzas. Not as a propaganda exercise. Not to manufacture the kind of rage that makes men fight harder, though rage would come and they would fight harder. Because soldiers who understood the true nature of what they opposed fought differently than soldiers operating on abstractions. And the men who had been killed in the fields outside this village, the women and children who had died inside this church, they deserved to be known. Known by the very man whose mission it was to ensure that the people who had murdered them were destroyed. The intelligence effort launched after Patton's visit to Marzas produced results within weeks. The unit was identified, its movements tracked, and through the disintegrating chaos of the German withdrawal across Alsace, winter of 1944 bleeding into 1945, Brenner and his command stumbled directly into the path of the Third Army's advance. He was taken in February 1945. They brought him to a Third Army interrogation facility. American intelligence officers questioned him with a JAG officer present, someone whose sole purpose was ensuring every word extracted could hold up in a courtroom afterward. Patton himself was not in the room. He had a war to prosecute, and the interrogation of prisoners, even prisoners carrying this weight, did not demand his physical presence. But the report landed on his desk. That report was thorough. What it contained was the meticulous, sterile account of a man recounting what he had done, and doing so inside the formal military interrogation conducted by the army that had crushed him, with the measured calculation of someone who believed cooperation might buy him a softer landing than defiance. Brenner did not deny Marzaz. He framed it in the vocabulary of military necessity, deploying the security doctrine language drilled into him by his training. The population, he explained, had furnished material support to illegal combatants. His actions, he maintained, fell within the boundaries of his orders and aligned with the operational demands of his command. He was precise, he was bloodless. He described the killing of men in the fields and the burning of women and children inside the church in the same flat register he used to detail supply logistics. When this interrogation report reached Patton, he read every page. Then he composed a response to his intelligence staff, a document also preserved in the Third Army records. He stated that the interrogation confirmed everything required for legal purposes. The material was to be preserved and forwarded to the proper authorities for post-war prosecution. He stated that Brenner was to be held in secure custody and treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention, because the United States Army applied the Geneva Convention to its prisoners, regardless of what those prisoners had done. The application of the convention to a man like Brenner was not a personal courtesy extended to him. It was a standard the army upheld for its own reasons, reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with whether the prisoner merited it. Then Patton wrote something else. He wrote that he had read Brenner's account of the events at Marzas, that the clinical precision of the description disturbed him in ways that fury or contrition never could have, because it exposed something about the machinery that had manufactured Brenner, something that ordinary criminal brutality would never have revealed. Brenner was not a man who had snapped, not a man who had overstepped his training. He was a man who had executed his training with perfect fidelity, who had performed exactly the function the system he served had engineered him to perform. And this, Patton wrote, was the thing that demanded understanding about the enemy. Not that it spawned monsters acting outside human boundaries, but that it forged men who had been methodically conditioned to regard Marzas as a routine military operation. This was the thing they were fighting, not individual evil, though individual evil saturated every corner of it, but a system that had industrialized evil, a system that had erected the structures, the curricula, the doctrine required to transform Marzas from an aberration into standard operating procedure. The destruction of that system was what the war was actually about. The bedrock truth beneath all the strategy, all the logistics, all the operational planning. The reason any of it mattered. He wrote that he hoped the men inheriting the post-war reckoning grasped this. Punishing individual perpetrators, necessary, right, but not enough. What the moment demanded was an accounting that penetrated to the system itself, the doctrine, the training, the command architecture that had made Marzas possible. If the post-war tribunals failed to reach that depth, they would have failed to accomplish the one thing that actually needed accomplishing. He wrote that he held little optimism they would reach that threshold. The processes taking shape were being architected by lawyers, diplomats, politicians, People who grasped individual criminal responsibility with precision, but who understood systemic accountability far less clearly. That gap between what the moment demanded and what the machinery of justice was likely to deliver, he found it deeply troubling. The post-war trials at Nuremberg turned out more sophisticated than Patton had feared. The concept of crimes against humanity, the prosecution of commanders for the acts carried out by their units, the effort to hold the system itself to account by prosecuting the men who had constructed it and kept it running. These were genuine attempts to accomplish exactly what Patton had described in his report. Whether they fully succeeded is a question historians and legal scholars have fought over ever since. Brenner stood trial after the war. Evidence drawn from the Third Army interrogation formed part of the case against him. He was convicted. The sentence corresponded to what had been done at Marzas, which is to say, no sentence could ever truly correspond to what had been done at Marzas, because no punishment a court could hand down would ever be proportionate to that crime. But it was what the law was capable of producing, and it was produced. Patton never lived to witness the trials. He died in December 1945, 7 months before the Nuremberg verdicts came down. He had written what he believed needed writing and spoken what he believed needed speaking. The processes he had fed with evidence and testimony moved forward without him. The village of Marzas was rebuilt after the war. The church rose again from its foundations. A memorial was placed at the site where the men had been shot. Another stood inside the reconstructed church, for the women and children. The memorial carries the names of every person who died there in the summer of 1944. 83 names, carved in stone, in a village in Alsace that most people have never heard of. A village that soldiers of Patton's Third Army found in the winter of 1944 as nothing more than burned walls and collapsed roofs, and the particular silence of a place that had been shown what the system they were fighting actually did, when it operated exactly as designed. Patton had walked through that silence. He had understood something that altered his comprehension of the entire war. He wrote it down in a report preserved within the Third Army records. He had said the soldiers needed to know. And in the winter and spring of 1945, as the Third Army drove east, the full magnitude of what that system had produced revealed itself. Not only in scorched villages, but in the camps, the mass graves, the meticulous documentation of industrial murder that advancing armies uncovered across Germany. The soldiers knew. They knew precisely what they had been fighting, and they finished the job.